Hi, everyone. It's Miss Angel Diaz and
Miss Sheaff, hello.
hi. So we're trying something with Zoom where we're sharing our screen and we want to get you started with Heart of Darkness. So we'll post this in Classroom and you'll be able to, watch it as many times as you want, especially if you miss us. And we're going to give you the background information that you need to get started on the book. So the first thing that we want to do is give you a little bit of background on the author, Conrad himself. So the first link that we've attached here is the notes that I'm using to be able to provide the lecture. And normally, if this was regular class, I would just lecture and you would take notes, but we're adapting. So you've got all of the notes here, and I'll kind of go through and give highlights as well. And then the other thing that's in our day one slides is a slide presentation that Ms. Sheaff put together, and there's going to be some background information in there for you also. So a little bit on Conrad, a little bit on the history of the Congo. So you've got a lot of resources here, and we're going to kind of walk you through all of them today. So I'm going to start off with Conrad. So Conrad was born in Poland. Joseph Theodore Conrad Korzeniowski. Sorry, all my pronunciations are going to be bad. And I'm going to start off kind of with his childhood because Conrad was a really interesting guy. And as Ms. Sheaff will talk about later on, there's some controversy around Heart of Darkness, and I think understanding a little bit more about Conrad and his life and his childhood may help you make some of those decisions, because a lot of the time you're wondering, is Conrad or Marlowe, who's our main character, what are they trying to say? Are they trying to uphold moral, perfection in some way? Or are they actually believing the things that are being documented in the book? So having this background could be helpful. So Apollo was Conrad's father, and he was very patriotic, and he was a writer and a translator, which is probably where Conrad gets a lot of his skill from. In 1856, he married Eva Bobrowska, and she was from a less politically active, very aristocratic Polish family in Oratov. And her family was not in agreement for this marriage. In fact, he couldn't marry her until, I think it's her grandfather passes away. And then they're able to get married. They didn't agree with him mostly because of his activism. He had high principles and morals, but he didn't bring a lot of financial security to Eva. He eventually exhausted his wife's dowry and devoted himself to politics and writing, and his wife's family actually had to support him and her and Joseph when he was born. When he was born, it was in Poland under Russian rule, and Apollo was arrested by the Russian authorities in Warsaw for his political activities, and he was supporting the 1863 Polish insurrection against Russian rule. He and his whole family was exiled to Siberia in a prison camp. And his wife was co-accused, I guess, because of the relationship. And her letters to him were used as evidence against him. So it was pretty devastating for the family. Due to the intervention of their relatives, the Korzeniowski family was allowed to move to Chernikov, much further south, because Eva was ill. Eva died in 1865, despite the efforts to, keep her well, of tuberculosis. And Conrad was only 7 when his mother died. Conrad spends the summer with his uncle, who becomes pretty important in his life. His name is Thaddeus Bobrowski. And so it's mom's brother, right? Not dad's brother. That's a distinction that we need to pay attention to. The Bobrowski family were part of the aristocracy, and they had money, right? So this should have been a good situation for Joseph. Apollo also in 1868 became seriously ill with tuberculosis. He's allowed to move to a city called Louvre with Conrad. And this Conrad becomes an avid reader and begins writing. In 1869, his father dies of tuberculosis in Krakow, leaving Conrad orphaned at the age of 11. So Conrad is then taken into the care of his uncle Thaddeus. Uncle Thaddeus is cautious and practical. He wasn't part of any kind of political activities or anything like that. Conrad was able to attend school and remained under the benevolent, I love this line, benevolent but careful guardianship of his uncle. So again, you could look at that as being positive or stifling, depending, right? Conrad is sent to a boarding house in Krakow and then sent with a tutor to Switzerland. He's also sent to school in Louvre, but he becomes kind of bored in school. He does, in 1873, it says that, he has his kind of first love, right? In 1874 to 75, Thaddeus allows Conrad to move to Marseille and begin his career as a seaman in the French merchant marines. And he's 17 years old at this time. He sails on his first voyage as a passenger on the Mont Blanc and then sails as an apprentice on the same ship to the West Indies. And this is like where he finds his love, right? He's written about travel and everything, but like this is the first time he's been on a ship and he finds his passion for sailing. He sails from 1876 to 78 to the West Indies as a steward on the Saint Antoine. And then he's unable to work because of some kind of irregularity in his papers, and he falls into debt. Now, in 1878, there's a few different stories about this. Like they say maybe because his papers weren't good, he was doing some gun running, or he fell in love and she broke his heart. Like there's all kinds of stories, but there's some kind of evidence that maybe he got into some kind of trouble and attempts suicide. Sometimes it says he's injured in a duel and it's not suicide. He's rebuked by his uncle for his extravagant spending, and he, again, rumored to start smuggling arms to Spain, and maybe influenced by this Rita de la Stola, with whom he was allegedly in love. In June of 1878, he arrives at Lowestoft to enter the British Merchant Navy. In July, he joins the Skimmer of the Seas for 6 voyages, but he quarrels. He gets into a fight and loses his job, and his uncle refuses to send him any more money. So he's kind of on his own at this point. He joins the wool clipper, which is called the Duke of Sutherland, bound for Australia as just kind of an ordinary seaman. He spoke no English when he left France, but he learns to speak English by the age of 21, which is his 5th language, if I'm counting correctly. So Polish and Russian and French. There's another one in there too, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And then English after that. And it's important to note that because it's his 5th language, but that's what he writes The Heart of Darkness in. It's not a translation. Conrad wrote the book in English. So you can imagine, just from whatever limited experience you have with an additional language, with the language that you've learned, imagine trying to write a great novel using that language. It's very challenging, and each word has to be contemplated and considered, right? So that's an important detail when you look at the diction in this novel. In June, he passes his examination as a second mate, and now he is an officer on a clipper, which is a type of ship titled the Loch Etive, bound for Sydney. In September, he sails again on the steamship Palestine for the Far East. In 1878 through 1894, from the ages of 22 to 36, he's just like adventuring. He's a merchant seaman going on voyages, especially to the Far East, the South Seas, and becomes the basis of many of his novels and short stories. In 1886, he becomes a naturalized British subject. He passes an examination for a master's certificate and writes his first short story, The Black Mate. In 1890, he visits Europe and meets his Aunt Marguerite Poradowska in Brussels and his Uncle Thaddeus in Poland. So he kind of travels around and spends time with family. In June, he's appointed the captain of a river steamer on the Congo. And so you can see that Conrad's life is going to kind of mirror or bring in added expertise for what he's about to write about in The Heart of Darkness. So he's going to pull from his own experiences here. In January, he returns sick to England and convalesces at Champel near Geneva. He returns to sea as a first mate on the clipper Torrens for Australia. In February, his uncle dies, February 1894. Thaddeus Bobrowski dies. In October, he publishes Almayer's Folly. And in November, he meets Jessie George, who becomes his future wife. And then basically the next few years from 1895 through 1903 is a lot of publications. So he's publishing all of these works that he has been basically collecting information and data from all of his travels. And then the second half of my notes, if you scroll through kind of to the bottom, is the first, what I'm going through is like a timeline, right? But the second part of the notes is more paragraphs that have the same information that I've gone over. The only thing to add is that he and Jessie George, they have 2 sons. And by 1910, he started to get some recognition of his work. Their financial situation improves. And then in 1924, he refused an offer of knighthood from the Prime Minister, MacDonald, and then that same year he dies. So that's a kind of the last bit of notes that I have, and then the very end is all of his published works. So you can kind of see everything that he has in the timeline of when it occurred. So a couple of things to note is that because of his childhood, Conrad is maybe the least political person on earth, right? He watched his father struggle, and he watched his mother die, and he watched his father die because of their dedication to being, very politically active and fighting against the Russians. And because of that, he didn't want to be involved in any kind of politics at all. And it was an option for him because his Uncle Thaddeus could have helped him with that. And so I think that's really something to keep in mind, because a lot of what's happening in the book in the Congo is very politicized during the time period. And people are hearing all kinds of rumors coming out of what's going on. And people were, making choices on what they wanted to make people aware of, and what would the consequences be for them if they did that. And so I think when you read The Heart of Darkness, you can see a lot of ways that Conrad maybe could have been a little bit more persuasive, a little bit more political in the way he puts the book together, but that's not his intention. Conrad's true intention and true passion was for travel. It was for the journey. Even as a little boy, he loved maps. He loved and studied maps. He has writings about looking at maps that have these big like gray areas where no one has been there yet, and he wanted to be the one to go there. And so he's motivated by that curiosity, not by politics, not like his father. I think that's a really important note for looking at the book and looking at Conrad in his life.
Nice. So that was some great biographical information on Joseph Conrad. And like Miss Angel Diaz said, it's super important to know about the author, the biographical context, because it adds a lot to our understanding of the novel when we read it. Just like the biographical context is important, we also need to know some of the historical context, because this book is taking place somewhere that we really don't hear a lot about in our history classes growing up. So some of it may be new to us, and some of it will kind of be assumed that you know what's going on. So we want to introduce a few of those things now. So some historical background. The book takes place, well, first it's taking place in Belgium, and then a ship launches off from the port and heads south, and the ship goes all the way down the coast of Africa, the west coast, and the ship ends up in the Congo, and that's where the majority of the story is taking place. And you'll get some more information about the geography later on. So here's where they launch off from. So we've got Belgium and Europe as our setting, and then we've got the Congo as our setting. So things we need to know about the Congo. The European countries at this time were fighting for power all over the African colonies. We've kind of talked about colonization in this class, but specifically in Africa, Britain, France, Portugal, and Germany all had claims to the Congo area, and they all wanted to keep each other out. So it was very much it was kind of like a scramble to kind of pick up this land and claim it as their own. They were all looking for money. They were all looking for opportunities to explore and get resources and increase their own wealth of their country. So King Leopold II, he's a man that should be like, if we're studying all of the awful dictators and rulers of history, King Leopold II should be on the list. But for some reason, I feel like in our history classes over the years, he doesn't pop up. So we're gonna introduce this terrible man to you now. So King Leopold II, he's the king of Belgium, and he starts off his reign in a way that you would think, okay, he's just like a normal prince. He's just a normal king. He started, I'm trying to get the exact date for you guys. He got the throne in, let's see, in 1865. So again, he takes over. It's 1865. Everything seems relatively normal, but he became obsessed with this idea of exploration and expansion, and like making Belgium this great nation that would be on par with all these other countries that were taking land. Here he is, his profile off to the side. So when he really starts taking control and making moves, this is in the 1880s, he's setting up a government. And like I said, he's trying to expand. So the problem is money for all these European countries. To fund all these exploration trips, they needed money. And he did have a lot of money, but it couldn't cover the costs of what he wanted to do. So he decides to head into a place, he decides to head into the Congo, but he's masking the exploration there as a humanitarian project. So he's like, yeah, we're going to get our best explorers. We're going to check out this area, see what's there. Well, what was there was a lot of people that he eventually forced into essentially slavery and got them to work in agriculture. And what was there was also rubber, which was a very in-demand material at the time. So once he discovered all of that, he's still trying to mask all of this as a humanitarian effort. He establishes the Congo Free State, and he basically is sending people over there to fill quotas for resources. So all of these officers there have to fill quotas for rubber. There was also, they were looking at ivory, gold and diamonds, but lots of rubber. And to fill these quotas that King Leopold wanted, the officials there were using awful tactics, abusing the people, physically mutilating them. And we're going to read more about that awful history of what these Belgian officers put the people of the Congo through. He basically worked the people to death. In fact, when King Leopold started all of this, and then when all of this ended, it was in 1908 when the land was finally ceded back to the whole government. It didn't just belong to King Leopold and his exploits. The population they're estimating was at 20 million in the Congo, in that area, and it decreased to 10 million. And then it didn't become a free state until 1971, just a fun fact. But King Leopold is doing all of these awful things. More information here. Again, just anything not owned by another European was considered the king's specific property. He wanted to extract and control massive amounts of ivory and rubber. That whole area of Africa, it was quote unquote open to any European to do business and lease property. Again, understanding that none of that land was theirs. These people in the Congo had their own systems, their own societies already set up. And then more information, he was making millions of dollars through this. He had a harsh military government. It ensured that only traders and slave labor worked on his land. So there was no opportunity for like other people to set up their own kind of ways to get resources. He had a monopoly over it. His armies were terrorizing local populations into fear and servitude. This is a picture of just kind of what the labor system would have looked like. You can tell none of this is voluntary. It is essentially slave labor. And he was doing this all sort of in secret. It took the efforts of a lot of people to, write, publish stories, do investigations to expose everything that King Leopold was doing in the Congo. You're going to get more information on the history, but just know there were all these atrocities going on, and these are things that our narrator is going to observe as he's, where's my mouse? Oh, sorry guys. These are all things the narrator is going to observe as he's moving through the Congo, but it will help for you guys to know some of the background about King Leopold and what was going on there. All right.
And we've pulled a lot of the information that we have about the Congo and King Leopold from a text called King Leopold's Ghost. And if you are interested, it is a fascinating read. It is not fiction, and it tries to document as good as possible. But people were destroying documents all the time to try to cover up what was really happening. But as much as possible, trying to document the devastation of what happened in the Congo under King Leopold's reign. There is I haven't watched it yet. Ms. Sheaff and I have talked multiple times about watching it, but there is a documentary on Amazon Prime on King Leopold's Ghost. It's titled King Leopold's Ghost. It looks promising, so if you get a chance and you have some time, you could watch that. In addition, there is not really a movie about Heart of Darkness. The closest thing that we have is called Apocalypse Now. You could watch it ahead of time to kind of get tone and mood. it's a different setting completely. It's a different time period. It's a different country, but the main character's name is Marlowe. And so it is an interesting take. It's basically what happened in the Congo, but it's told as occurring during the Vietnam War. It's a great movie, but extremely violent and definitely R-rated. So if you are so inclined to take a look at that, it's a brilliant film. So let's see. I'm going to go over now some background you need for reading. I'll try to make it as short as I can, but I want it to be helpful. So like Beloved, there are a few things in here that make this read challenging. When I first started teaching AP, I went to the summer, institute to learn how to be an AP teacher. And this text was one that they said you had to read ahead of time. So I grabbed the book and I looked at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so short. It's like some pages, maybe even shorter than that. I can't remember. And I was like, I'll read this the day before, right? So I went down, I sat in my car, rolled the windows down. It's a beautiful day. The birds were chirping outside, opened up my book, and I was like, all right, let's get through this puppy. And I read the first 3 pages, and then I stopped, and I knew I had made a big mistake because I had no idea what was going on in the book after 3 pages. So then I was like, okay, let me reread those 3 pages. Focus. Get your mind in it here, right? Pay attention. So I read the 3 pages again, and I basically kind of got an idea of who the main characters were and where they were, but I still had very little understanding. So on the 3rd read, I pretty much pieced it all together. And then I realized there was no way I was going to be prepared to discuss this work in depth in a 2-hour read. It just wasn't going to happen. And the reason for that is the really kind of ambiguous qualities in the book. The diction that's being used is challenging. This book is often described as dense, right? So you read a line of it, and then you realize, I need to understand 4 things in this sentence before I can really understand what he's saying here. And so you have to break down each piece, and the sentences are longer, right? So they're really compound sentences with many things happening. And so you got to break each one down and go back and reread it for, just to clarify what's going on. Then once you do that, you can figure out what the significance of what's being said is, right? So what plays into that is the vocabulary itself. Conrad is writing this book from his 5th language. He's paying attention to every word he's writing. And then the ambiguity in there happening too, based on the descriptions. He doesn't provide us a lot of information on how to think or feel. He mostly is just giving us observations, what he sees, what he hears, not a lot of commentary on what he thinks or what we're supposed to think. And so that's challenging, to have a narrator and a character who's just providing you with, here's what I see and here's what I hear, and not really providing you with, how am I supposed to think or feel about it, right? It is a frame story. You guys have seen frame stories before, but we've got kind of 3 perspectives within the frames to consider. So obviously we know Conrad is our author, right? And then we've got this outer narrator, which is an outside narrator, and he's looking at this outside story that's the inner frame is happening within. I don't know how much detail I want to give you, but this outside narrator has his own ideas and his own commentary on the inner story that our main character, Marlowe, is going to tell, right? So we get introduced to this older Marlowe by this outer narrator who, isn't really part of the inner story. Marlowe is the one in the inner story. So then the question is always, is Conrad the author, the outside narrator, or is Conrad the author, the Marlowe narrator, or is he above both of them? And what's really interesting is the outer narrator has some, pretty strong feelings or opinions about Marlowe that he expresses to us through mostly description. We see this description of Marlowe, and the outer narrator is conveying to us kind of how he feels about Marlowe. So if Conrad is representing himself and his opinions in the outer narrator, then there's one way to read and feel about Marlowe's story. If Conrad is the Marlowe in the story, if he, and it feels like he could be, because we've seen from the biography or the biographical information that Conrad has been to the Congo. He has been a steamboat captain. He has, traveled the same road that we're going to see Marlowe go on. So it just makes sense to align Marlowe and Conrad as the same. And if that's true, then we are learning a lot about not only Marlowe, but about Conrad. If that's not true, if Conrad is separate from Marlowe and he's letting Marlowe do all of these things, but his opinions are different, then we could actually be looking at more of a satirical or, jaded view of what happened. And as you read, you'll see, and you'll have to make your own decision about this. And at times you can believe that Conrad is Marlowe. And at times you can believe that Conrad and Marlowe's opinions are differing. So you'll have to kind of decide from that. The frame allows for some confusion about whose point of view is the one that Conrad really is trying to represent. And so as you read, you'll be able to start making those choices, I think. And I think one of the things that's going to come out of those decisions is whether or not you believe that Conrad is in disagreement with what's happening in the Congo, or part of what's happening in the Congo. And you'll have to kind of decide that for yourself. Anybody who read, Things Fall Apart knows a little bit about what Achebe thinks. And so Ms. Sheaff will comment on that. I don't want to say any more, but she'll comment on that at the end. All right. So we're going to give you a chance to get your footing in the book before you even get started. So Ms. Sheaff had some really great pictures of the setting in her slide presentation. This one is obviously when different places are colonized, right? The people who come in change and influence what things are called, right? So this map has some of the native terms on it, but we can tell you from the book how these names have been changed based on King Leopold's influence, right? And the people who work for him. So you can see down at the bottom left corner that the red arrow is pointing to what Conrad is going to call the mouth of the Congo. So one of the first places that they are going to stop is Boma. So once they get in, and they're going to let people off and let people on, and that's what he's going to talk about. He's going to right away call the Congo a snake, and the mouth opens to the ocean, right? Then you'll see from Boma, that's going to be a stopping point. And from Boma, he's going to go to Matadi. And you'll see Matadi referenced in there. Now, what's really interesting, Ms. Sheaff, will you do the pointer? Is you can see right where Matadi starts, the river has all the lines on it. That is impassable by ships. So you can't bring an ocean-bearing ship into the Congo River and travel upriver. There's a section of the river that no boats really can travel on. It's just not passable. So from Matadi to Kinshasa, you can see on land there is some what looks like railroad tracks. And during this time period, many of the native people have been taken from their villages to work on this project, right, to build this railroad that would take people from Matadi to Kinshasa in a quicker way. Right now, though, the railroad is not complete. And so they will have to walk that. they will walk from Matadi to Kinshasa, and you'll see that pretty early on in the book. Then once they get to Kinshasa, everything that they need to travel further upriver has to be carried with them. So when you're looking at that point, the river is passable by ship, but everything you need to build the ship has to be carried from Matadi to Kinshasa. So in Kinshasa, they will assemble the steamers. And so you'll hear him talk about that process of trying to build these steamers in Kinshasa. Then from Kinshasa, he travels all the way up to what's referred to on this map as Boyoma Falls, but in our book it's going to be called Stanley Falls. So you can see that is his voyage. That is where he is going to be headed. It's Kinzangani is the name of it, and it's in our text going to be called Stanley Falls. So much of what happens in the text is not well explained. You got to look for references for time and place. They don't happen a lot. And if you get lost in time and place, the book is just going to become more and more and more confusing. So we wanted to give you this kind of a little bit ahead of time. You can go back and reference this presentation if you need to, but you should be able to get your footing in the text a little bit better, just keeping track of when and where things are happening.
Nice. All right, good. So as Miss Angel Diaz was saying, with the frame story and, is Joseph Conrad the author? Is he more closely tied to the narrator's perspective? Is he Marlowe, the character that we're, tracking along the river? So some of you guys read the novel Things Fall Apart as the extra credit book during the first semester. His book, Things Fall Apart, is actually a reaction to this book, Heart of Darkness. So it says at the top here that some literary critics have criticized Conrad as being racist and biased. This opinion, if you're seeing Joseph Conrad, the author, as the character Marlowe, you could come to this conclusion. Says some question the validity of how Conrad has chosen to portray the African people. Miss Angel Diaz already mentioned that as you're reading Heart of Darkness, you're getting a lot of observations about these atrocities and about the way that that they're colonizing the Congo and about the way they're extracting labor. But are those observations just part of the character Marlowe, or is the fact that there's no moral judgment being passed, is that a flaw of a potentially racist narrator, or sorry, racist author? So the way you see Conrad's role will depend. Maybe you would agree with Chinua Achebe, because he delivered a scathing lecture at Harvard about the book Heart of Darkness and the way that they are portraying the people of the Congo, because the people of the Congo that are being enslaved and forced to work, they're not given, a side story. They're not given an explanation. They're not shown any humanity. We're just getting observations. We're not getting moral judgments. Despite these controversies, this book is still widely taught. Miss Angel Diaz and I had a conversation that this book may show up in your on your college syllabus in a year or two. It's very popular to teach in both high schools, more like the AP level, or in college. And the controversies make it that much more interesting. So know that, this is not a perfectly black and white sort of understood novel. There's not a common consensus here, and that'll make our conversations about it interesting. And if you've read Things Fall Apart, you'll be able to see very clearly, now Chinua Achebe is giving a fully human character in the narrator, in the main character of his novel, a person native to Africa that was not given or acknowledged in Heart of Darkness. So if you've read Things Fall Apart, we want to hear from you throughout too, the opinions you might have about it. Anything to add, Miss Angel Diaz?
Nope.
Awesome. The last slide. Okay, so we acknowledge that we didn't get to scan this book out before the closure. However, we've linked a couple PDF versions. This one's from Gutenberg.org. It hyperlinks the 3 parts. This novel is in 3 parts. This one looks like this. And then here's another one. There are more PDFs available. You could even download it so you can have it once and take it with you on like a tablet or your smartphone. This one looks like this. And there's other ones available too. If you wanted to order it, I don't know how fast Amazon is shipping things these days because we're all using Amazon more, I think. But the ISBN for the version is there.
And whatever you do, you're going to be happier if you print and you're able to write on it. It's like Beloved in the sense that you're going to have lots and lots of questions. So being able to highlight or write on it. So if you do use a PDF and you don't want to print it out, convert it so that you can, put comments on it. It's just going to make the reading of it easier.
Yeah. I was just, as she was talking, I was flipping through my own version, which is very marked up. Because Ms. Angel Diaz and I, we need to annotate as we read. We are not, we're not able to get by without that either. So we also posted look fors. So we'll see, as we continue on with our closure, what an assignment might look like. But for now, we're just posting this list. These are things we want you to kind of be looking for as you read. Things to do with imagery, the ambiguity Miss Angel Diaz mentioned, motifs to look at, madness, right? All these things. And then lastly, connections to things fall apart if you read it. So read over this list before you start the book, just to give you some direction. It is dense, as Miss Angel Diaz said. It's complicated. Some of it's mysterious and you don't know what's going on. So this is meant to help out with that.
And then the last thing we have is like just basic study questions. And I say basic study questions, but they're still pretty challenging to answer just for this text. So some of not many of you are, in the Merchant Marines or anything like that. So a lot of the language is going to be nautical language, right? So a clipper is a ship and all of it, you're just not going to know some of the terms. So you're going to have to look stuff up. And even that first question, why is the Nelly still, right? You can actually in the book point to the line that answers that question, but you have to answer several questions to understand it, right? So what is a Nelly? And then on top of that, like, why is it supposed to be moving? And so you'll have to be able to kind of riddle through what's happening in the text. But most of these things you can actually find right in the text. They're level 1 questions, most of them. And you don't have to write these down. Obviously, we're not collecting them for a grade, but it will be your check for understanding. So if you read part 1 and you can't answer number 20 on the map with the colored pins, what do these colors represent and why is the red good to see? Well, then you haven't understood the book on a very, very simplistic level, because literally you can point to that line and answer that question. So this should be your first check. Do I understand what's happening here? And they go in chronological order. So if you read the first 7 pages, you should be able to answer the first few questions. And if you can, you're on the right track. And if you can't, then like me, go, oh crap, and go back and read it again, right?
Yeah. And we'll, and good, those are all linked on the slides, which you'll have access to. All right, so we hope that we gave you some good introductory information on Joseph Conrad, on some of the stuff going on historically that will be referenced, and it will just be assumed that you know. You got some information on the way the story is structured, what's going to be challenging about it. You got your footing with the map, and this area of the world that maybe you haven't looked at recently. And then down here, you have some links to the PDFs and look for and study questions.
So expect another presentation, maybe not quite as long as this one. Coming up, we're going to do day 2, where we get you set looking at tone and mood in Heart of Darkness. So enjoy day 1, and we'll see you again soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.